Hi friends, today we are going to discuss about International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. I am Dr. Suresh Badatmat, Professor of Psychiatry working at NIMANS, Bangalore. Every year on 13th October, we celebrate International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. This year's theme is Disaster Risk Governance. Before I start my presentation, I would like to have a disclaimer. This presentation is for academic purpose only, to generate awareness among the public. This is not a legal opinion. If you want to have a legal opinion, please do contact an advocate. So before we move ahead, let's understand what do you mean by disaster. Does disaster means one death or 100 deaths should occur, a railway accident, or a motorcycle accident, or a fire in a mall should be considered as a disaster? Let's define disaster to understand what this disaster means. Because there are various definitions of disaster across various agencies, various legislation, various countries, and various states. Without knowing what is disaster, it is difficult to understand the common meaning. So, as per National Disaster Management Act of 2005, especially from India, disaster means a catastrophe, mishap, calamity, or a grave occurrence in any area arising from natural or man-made cause or by an accident or negligence which results in substantial loss of life or human sufferings or damage to and destruction of property or damage to degradation of environment and is of such a nature or magnitude as to be beyond the coping capacity of the community affected area. So it's a very complex definition. And if you look into the various definition of disaster, it's varying across the country, across the state, across the geography, across time. So disaster, there is no one single definition. So every country have their own definition. This is the definition from National Disaster Management Act of 2005 from India. But however, if you look at the various definitions across the world, there are some commonalities can be seen. The characteristics of disaster. They are sudden in onset, uncertainty of occurrence. It is very difficult to predict with reasonable, or what we call it as with precise timing. It's very difficult to predict. Uncontrollable, huge magnitude of destruction, human loss and suffering, greatly exceed the coping capacity of the community which has affected. Should be beyond the coping capacity of the community. That is very essential. With this, now after understanding the disaster, we will understand what is governance. So because this year theme is disaster risk governance.
International Day for Disaster Reduction began in 1989, after a call by the United Nations General Assembly for a day to promote a global culture of risk awareness and disaster reduction. This year's theme on International Day for Disaster Reduction 2020 is Disaster Risk Governance. We need to know the meaning of governance. Governance means different things to different people, therefore we have to get our focus right. The actual meaning of the concept depends on the level of governance we are talking about, the goals to be achieved and the approach being followed. Is it at the village level, district level, state level or national level? The actual meaning of the concept depends on the level of governance we are talking about, the goals to be achieved and the approach being followed. We need a clear vision, plans, and competent, empowered institutions acting on scientific evidence for the public good. Governance means the way a group of people, in a village or a district or a state or a country, do things. This year's International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction is all about governance. You can measure good disaster risk governance in lives saved, reduced numbers of disaster-affected people, and reduced economic loss. Come, let's join hands on the eve of International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. This day gives an opportunity for all, including governments, community groups, civil societies, the private sectors, and every citizen to promote best practices across all sectors, to reduce disaster risk and disaster loss in terms of mortality, morbidity and financial loss.
After knowing the governance, let's understand what is good governance. Good governance has 6 dimensions. These dimensions are given by World Bank. It's been observed over a period of time across the world. So the World Bank says that the 6 dimensions are voice and accountability. So every government, every state government, every local governance, including citizens' governance, should have voice and accountability. Even every citizen should be accountable. And the country should have political stability and lack of violence. This is very essential. And government effectiveness of its functioning. Regulatory quality should be essential. Rule of law. That means law is equal to everyone. And control of corruption. This is very essential, especially in disaster. In one of our study from Andaman Nicobar during tsunami, we found that the absence of corruption makes the people to believe the governance, and they do invest in their money, their time in rehabilitation. So the corruption-free environment is very, very essential during disaster management. So how we are doing well in India? In India, in 2005, immediately after the disaster, that is basically tsunami, which occurred on 26th of December 2004. So in 2005, Disaster Management Act was passed in the Parliament. And within 2006, the rules were framed, National Disaster Management Authority was formed, and in 2009, National Disaster Management Policy was also drafted and implemented. But however, in 2016, National Disaster Management Plan was drafted and implemented. The National Disaster Management Plan 2016 was drafted in the background of 2 important landmark events. The first, which occurred in March 2015 in Sendai, Japan, that is called as Sendai Framework for Disaster Management, which was later adopted by the United Nations. On the same year, 2015, September, Sustainable Development Goals were also declared. Based upon these 2 important events, National Disaster Management Plan was drafted and released on May 2016. This comprehensively covers the disaster management in India. Since India is a huge population of 138 crore population, requires disaster management plan. And geographically, our country is very diverse. There are certain earthquake prone areas, flood prone areas. So depending upon that, we require to have a national disaster management plan. So it was drafted and released. So now we have been hit by biological disaster. It is pandemic, COVID-19. Does it meet the definition of biological disaster? So looking at the National Disaster Management Authority in 2009 came up with the biological disaster definition. As per the biological disaster definition, these means a biological disaster are disease, disability or death occurring on large scale among the human, animals and plants due to the toxins or disease causing organisms like virus, bacteria, fungi or their products. So here coronavirus, that is COVID-19, fulfills that criteria, and it also fulfills the criteria for disaster. And this biological disaster may be natural, which is occurring from the animals, or else man-made, which is used intentionally against a country, maybe bioterrorism or biowarfare it can be called as. But at this point of time, it cannot be one. It is both. It is the combination of both will be considered invariably in any disaster. So disaster to strike, they should be both the nature and at the same time human hazardous behavior. So that is the reason nowadays we don't call it as a natural disaster. We call it as natural hazards. The nature is there, but how we behave with the nature creates natural hazards. So we are responsible for natural hazards. Moving to this, now what are the principles behind biological disaster management?
The principle of disaster management is based on preventive medicine.
From relief-centered post-disaster management to a holistic, multi-dimensional, inclusive preventive and community empowerment approach is the need of the hour. It is based on a strategy called 6R: resilience, fostering readiness, responsive relief work, rehabilitation and recovery.
Disaster management is everybody's business and everyone has a role to play in diverse kinds of disasters, emergencies, and humanitarian crisis.
After knowing about the principle of disaster management, especially biological disaster management, let's understand the phases of disaster. So if you look at this diagram, this talks about the phases of disaster. So on the y-axis, you can see the emotions. On the x-axis, you can see the duration. As soon as the disaster strikes, the heroic phase kicks in. The heroic phase lasts from somewhere around 1 week to 2 weeks. This is called as heroic phase. For simple reason, the survivors get together and they help each other. Many survivors become hero and they provide food, shelter, and the community at large will fight against the disaster. At the same time, once the 2 to 3 weeks moves off, the local agencies, the governmental agencies, international agencies, aid organizations will come into rescue. This rescue period is called as honeymoon phase. For simple reason, it is a media attention, political attention, bureaucrats attention, and all these attention turns into promises, various lobbying will be done, and at the same time, the survivors will stay in the relief camp with not doing anything, and they will be given food and shelter. This lasts somewhere between 2 weeks to 3 to 6 months. But however, by the end of the honeymoon phase, the disillusionment phase kicks in. This is called as disillusionment phase for simple reason. The promises made by the politicians, the bureaucrats becomes very difficult to achieve. The reason being is the government itself is going through a disaster, thin finances, and at the same time red tapeism or bureaucratism will play an important role. And at the same time, mental health issues starts cropping up this disillusionment phase. And this disillusionment phase lasts somewhere between 3 to 6 months to 3 to 4 years. So during this disillusionment phase, the mental health restoration, rehabilitation is very essential for the community to get back on its own for the restoration phase. So somewhere around 4 to 6 years down the line, restoration phase starts in. So these are the various phases of disaster. If you want to know more about this, please look into the link which I am providing here. To know about disaster, there are various videos I have done. Now let's understand the different phases of biological disaster. I discussed about the disaster in the previous one. Now, what does the biological disaster phases? The phase 1, it is called as no human infection. Phase 2 is animal to human infection, confirmed only few cases, that is phase 2. Phase 3 is sporadic or cluster of cases in human beings. Phase 4 is clearly community level outbreak, human to human transmission. Phase 5 is from community from 2 or more other countries it has been spread. Phase 6 is 2 or more regions of World Health Organization, that is continents, that is called as pandemic. And the other 2 more important phases is called as post-peak period. It is after the first peak and then subsequent peak is called as post-peak period. And finally, post-pandemic period. It is evaluating, acknowledging, looking at the effectiveness of strategy, lessons learned, rehabilitation, and preparing for the next disaster. So these are the various biological disaster phases. Now, if you combine both the biological disaster, that is pandemic phases, and the phases of disaster, this is how it looks. If you look at this, it's in the topper part, I'm talking about the biological phase, biological disaster, and the down is the normal disaster, how it moves. So the phase 1 and 2, that same thing happened. When there was coronavirus infection, which was already present in the China, most of the country did not do anything. And it took phase 3. And because of nowadays international air travel, it immediately moved into phase 4 and 5. It's very difficult to understand between 4 and 5. But by the end now, disillusionment phase is the period where we are going to have multiple peaks depending upon various population density and how we behave as a society decides how we go through phase 6. Moving to this, please understand, in any pandemic or any disaster, these are normal people in an abnormal situation. So there is a high possibility normal people will behave abnormally in such situation. So, but they are not mentally ill. That should be kept in mind. We have to pathologize the situation, not the people. And if you look at what is the disaster management, how we are going to do. First and the foremost is, before the disaster strikes, preventive and planning, that is preparedness, that is very, very essential. During the disaster and aftermath of disaster, curative is start treating the people, treating the survivors, look into the mental health issues, look at the alcohol use, substance use during the disillusionment phase, look for post-traumatic stress disorder, and for the healthcare workers and the relief workers, stress management is very essential. Once the disillusionment phase is over, we have to again go back to the preventive measures. Coming to what are the strategies to be adopted in biological disaster? And in biological disaster, please understand, when we do not know about the agent, like coronavirus, we knew nothing about the coronavirus during March. The only thing what could have been done is lockdown. That's what our nation did. The leaders took a decision. It was a bold decision. And at that time, because we never knew about our enemy. So that is the only way to do it. Social distancing, quarantining, isolation, lockdown. That is the only way, because we got time to prepare ourselves. And the lockdown occurred across the nation. So numbers were very, very less in the initial period. Next important is case detection, contact tracing, testing, and treatment. That is very essential in biological disaster. But when there is no specific treatment, then it becomes a much more challenging. At the same time, information management is very, very essential, is very critical, because that is going to play a very important role in mental health pandemic in the near future. At the same time, the biological disaster poses a huge challenge to the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare or the Health Department. Demand on medicines, vaccine, PPE, that is personal protective equipments, and treatment. This becomes very thin, and also the many healthcare workers starts dying. The anxiety in healthcare workers puts more stress, and this stress leads to many mistakes by the healthcare workers. Disruption of the hospital functioning, because the caseload increases, the demand on doctors and healthcare workers increases, and at that time, what's the best way is community empowerment to deal the crisis. This is very essential, because without the involvement of community, any number of doctors or health nurses is not going to help. And dealing with fatality, that is death, is very, very important, because as the number of increased death occurs, the society becomes more and more panicky, and they start going to the hospital very often, and it's very, very difficult to control the crowd in the hospital during biological disaster. So, looking at the whole thing, we have to understand from the biological disaster perspective, the implementation of Disaster Management Act of 2005 and Disaster Management Policy of 2009 and the Disaster Management Plan of 2016 requires a comprehensively cooperation between central and state government, especially in federal governments, coordination between various ministries and departments. Without coordination, it is simply impossible. Contribution from the private sector. This is the time private sectors, NGOs, and any religious institution should work with the government. They should not work against the government, because the whole nation during disaster is, because the disaster, as per the definition, is beyond the coping capacity of the community. So it is beyond the coping capacity of the community. So the community should not start fighting. So the community should stand together unitedly to fight against the disaster. And the other important point, active participation from civil societies, citizens, and community-based organizations. They should do an active work more than the government. Simple reason is, for example, you take coronavirus. Whatever amount of the government can do, if the citizens do not follow social distancing, or what we call it as physical distancing, wearing mask, not going outside very often, will create the pandemic continuously. So the citizens' contribution is more important than the government role. Every citizen has a role to play in disaster management. Please remember this. It is not just a government, it is not just an organization, it is not just a political party. Every citizen, you, me, and everyone who in the family and also in the society has to play a role in disaster management. You cannot say that I don't have any role to play. This is your society. And disaster does not discriminate between you, me, and any society or any religion or high income, low income. Disaster, like biological disaster, do not spare anyone. Coming to the disaster risk reduction, these are very essential to know, because disaster risk reduction revolves around these things. First and the foremost is risk assessments, awareness and education, coordination, planning and preparedness, laws and good governance is very essential, early warning system, contingency plans, information sharing and communication, and sustainable development. My dear friends, to conclude, disaster management revolves around the principle of preventive medicine. That is, prevention is better than cure. For that reason, disaster also needs preparation, preparedness, mitigation, avoiding risk factors, recognizing the risk factors, looking at the natural hazards, preparing for it, and preparing the community, preparing the human resources, and responding immediately when the disaster strikes. At the same time, financial capacity, management, especially the government and also non-governmental agencies and private partner, is very essential, especially in financial capacity building and rehabilitation during disillusionment phase, and again preparedness. So this plays a very important role. And the overall, the themes fits in very well. Theme of this year is disaster risk governance. If the governance is very good from individual citizen to the national level government, then the disaster management will be very smooth and easy. Otherwise, it's going to be chaos. If you like this video, please do subscribe to my channel. Thank you very much. Stay safe.